about how to get started, what you need to get started. We're going to talk knots, we're going to talk jigs, weights, we're going to talk about length of line that we're letting out, we're going to talk about setups, rod holders, rods and reels, knots, all that kind of stuff. So stick around, we're going to go over everything you need to get started and to learn how to troll for crappie. So why do I like to long line troll? Well, it's probably my favorite way to fish, and I like it so much because it's fast paced. There's always something to do. There's a variety of fish that you catch. You know, not only do you catch crappie in abundance with this method, you also catch white bass. You're going to catch white perch. Occasionally you're going to have a catfish, which catfish not my favorite thing to catch, but it keeps things exciting. You get on a big catfish, he tangles up all your lines. It can be actually just downright frustrating. But you catch a variety of fish. It's fast paced. It keeps you moving. You know, if you've ever really felt frustrated, like you're fishing in the wrong spot and there's nothing there to catch, you know, you just kind of need to move spots. Well, with long line trolling, you're always moving spots. So that's a big help. Brilliant fishing. We want more North Carolinians out spending more time on the water, being more successful, spending better time with their friends, their family, out enjoying God's creation that He's blessed us with here in this beautiful state. Okay, so let's talk rod selection for long line trolling. Well, obviously you can long line troll with just about any kind of a rod that you would use for crappie fishing. I've long line trolled before just using a little 5-foot ultralight rod that I would use for casting to brush. You can use something like that. You can also buy like these jigging rods. They're fairly flimsy rods. You don't need anything super substantial necessarily to pull a jig, like you would if you're pulling a crankbait or trolling for a larger type of fish like stripers or something. But you can usually get by with something pretty small like I've got right here. This is just a really basic, like a 5-foot rod paired to an inexpensive spinning reel. Like this is something that I just picked up, you know, for a few bucks. Doesn't have to be anything super complicated. You're really not doing that much reeling when it comes down to it. Long line trolling, you're putting these jigs out the back, maybe one cast length, and then all you got to do is, I mean, you know, you're basically not fighting a large fish where you need a lot of drag and a superior drag system. So cheap spinning reels typically will work for this. If you want to beef up your long line trolling spread a little bit, get some different rods, what I would suggest is getting a variety of lengths of different crappie jigging rods. And so you can get, they come in all sorts of different lengths. I mean, from 8-foot, 9-foot, 10-foot, 12, 14, 16. They come in all sorts of different varieties of lengths, which actually brings up a neat question. Why do we need all these different lengths of rods? And like, why does that even matter? Well, here's why it's important. So when you're trolling these, you want to spread these rods out the back of your boat. And you want to leave a couple of feet of separation in between, you know, the lines that are running in the back, you know, behind your boat. So, you know, you can put out like a short rod. Like let's say you're looking out the left side of your boat, put out a short rod nearest your motor. Okay, then a little bit longer rod on an angle next to that. Like say you got like an 8-foot, a 9-foot, come over with a 10, you can come over with a 12 or a 14, and so those will be staggered out the back of the boat, and you can stick those lines out off the side of your boat. Now, the advantage to that, two advantages. Number one, it keeps you from getting tangles so much when you're making turns, especially if you keep those rod tips down near to the surface of the water. But it also helps you keep those jigs out away from the boat. So the farther you can keep your lines out away from the boat, okay, the greater chance you're going to have of catching those fish that otherwise would spook when the boat runs over. Now, a lot of times of the year, this is not really much of an issue when you're fishing cold weather or clear water lakes, you know, where the fish are a little deeper anyway. You know, them spooking from the boat passing overhead, not as big of a deal. But when you're fishing in the springtime, during the spawn, fish are shallow, you know, you're fishing shallow water, you're going to spook a lot of fish just by running over them with your boat. So if you're long line trolling, which means the boat is passing the fish before the jigs get to it, okay, you want to have some of those jigs riding way off to the side where they're not going to be, you know, you're not going to have spooked fish. So let's talk about down rods. What are down rods and why should I utilize down rods? Well, when you're long line trolling, you got most of your lines out the back of the boat, and off to the sides of the boat, like pointing, your line's pointing backwards. But what sometimes is useful is to run what we call a down rod. So just off the side of your boat, nearest the front, if you got some rod holders there, just run a rod down with a heavy egg sinker or a weight attached above your jig. Some people even get really fancy with their down rod setups. So you actually put a weight at the bottom and then a 3-way swivel. It's up to you how you want to rig it, but basically you're running a rod that's more vertical than your long line trolling rods, and you're just running that off the side of the boat. The advantage to this is you're actually got more lines in the water. You're actually able to control your depth really well with the down rods, and you're actually picking up some fish in addition to the rods in the back. It allows you to fish the same water twice. Okay, you're fishing it with the down rod first, and then you're maybe even getting some attention from those fish as you're going by, even if they don't bite. And then you're going to be following up with your long line trolling jigs that are going to be coming along behind that same stretch of water again, and you're more likely to pick those fish up, in my opinion. So let's talk about rod holders. What kind of rod holders do you need to have to long line troll? Well, you can use any rod holder, to be quite honest, but if you really want to try and maximize your spread, you want to get more rods out, you want to have more control of where those rods are in the water, a good rod holder is going to be one that you can manipulate vertically and horizontally to spread those rods out so that your tips are close to the water. Okay, that's going to minimize tangles, and you want to be able to spread them out so you keep in about 2 feet of separation in between each of the lines going out the back of the boat. It's going to be your best setup. I like to use Millenium rod holders. Okay, it's not the only type out there, of course, but this has worked really well for me in the past. And so with the Milleniums, I can actually run, I have 2 base plates, one on the left and one on the right. I can run 4 rods off the left, 4 rods off the right. And then in addition to those, I can actually come up on the sides of my boat. I can actually run out some down rods out of some Driftmaster rod holders on the side. So a typical long line trolling spread for me, we're going to have 8 rods out the back on the Milleniums, and then we're going to have a couple of down rods off the side. So maybe as many as 10 rods going at a time. What kind of knot do we use? So a knot that I like to use when I'm trolling for crappie, and actually even when I'm casting jigs for crappie, is I like to use a loop knot. Now, there's more than one way to tie a loop knot. Now, many of you have seen loop knots tied before, where you start with an overhand knot, kind of like this. So this is one way that you can tie a loop knot. You start with an overhand knot. You can kind of see that. You're going to put your jig on. Yeah, if I can find that. There we go. Put that in through there, and then we're going to take, once we get that overhand knot in there, we're going to sort of pinch that, and then we're going to wrap about 3 times, 4 times, 3, 4, man, let's just go about 5 times, and then we're going to stick that end, if you can see that, we're going to stick it back through the circle that is in the middle of that loop, and then we're just going to pull it down. Okay, so that's probably one of the easiest ways to do a loop knot. There's a way that's a little bit quicker. It's easier when you're out on the water, and I find to be equally as effective. This is a really quick, really easy loop knot that you can tie when you've got old eyes like mine, and it's kind of hard to see. You get out in the bright sunshine, and you can't sit there and fiddle with that little delicate knot. This is a really easy loop knot. So here I've got my high-vis Mr. Crappie 6-pound line, which is what I use most of the time for everything from trolling and casting and all of that. So I got my line, I've got my jig, and so what I'm gonna do is just put my jig on my line, and I'm gonna pull through a pretty good amount, like probably 6-8 inches of extra line. Well, let's just say 6 inches. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna pinch that line together. All right, I'm gonna slide my fingers back, and then around my hand I'm gonna create a loop like this. I don't know if you can see that. Now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna pass this jig through that loop 3 times. 1, 2, 3. And so what you should be left with, it almost looks like an overhand knot, but I've got 3 passes with that jig head. Now in my hand over here, I've still got my tag end and my main line. I've got those together right here. I'm just gonna pull that down like this. Okay, I'm gonna pull that tight. Okay, and then I've got, well, this is an extra big loop. Okay, it doesn't have to be this big, right? But an extra big loop, and I've got my tag in. Something I like to keep around in my pocket and on the boat, a pair of dollar store toenail clippers. These things are really good. You can just trim your tag end, you're good to go. It allows for a lot of freedom of motion. Very easy, good to go. If you want to do something a little fancier, you can do a double jig rig with 2 loop knots, and here's the way you do that. You're gonna first put on your first jig head. You're gonna slide it up your line, maybe as far as you want up. You're gonna tie the top, the top one first. You're gonna take that, and this is the way I do it. To make a loop knot, I'm just gonna pull out like some extra slack, both lines. I'm gonna wrap that around 2 fingers, okay, just like this, okay. I'm gonna make a loop, right? Pull my fingers out of the loop, right? And then I'm gonna pass the jig head and the hook through that loop once, twice, 3 times, okay? So basically what I've got is a doubled overhand knot. I've passed it through 3 times. Okay, I'm gonna pull that down, okay? And then that's gonna put my jig head on my line just like that. Okay, so put my bait on, I'm good to go. Then we'll go down to the other end of my line, and then I'll just put on my second jig head with the same type of loop knot. So I'm gonna go up, leave myself a little bit of slack, wrap it around my fingers, pass it through 1, 2, 3 times, pull it down. I'm gonna trim my tag in with my handy dandy little clippers. All right, and so now what I've got, I don't know if you can see all this in the frame at the same time. I'll try to get it both in the frame, but I've got my 2 jig heads tied with loop knots. I've got them, just a little bit, spaced, foot or so apart. You can practice with that, whatever you want to, kind of spacing you want to use. All right, so that's a good way to do it. It's a fancy way. I find that the double jig, rig just like this, probably gets more bites. So that's the upside. The downside is it's a lot more frustrating. When you get a snag, which happens a lot, you're losing twice the tackle. You get twice the tangles, and the tangles are twice as complicated to undo. So the upside, downside to running the double jigs. I do think what happens is as they run through the water, the first jig, as it passes by the fish, I think attracts the attention. And then the second jig catches the fish. Well, at least that's my theory. What long line trolling is all about, you're moving a jig through the water, usually at a fixed speed. And there are 3 variables that are going to determine how your jig rides through the water, the depth that is. One is going to be the weight of your jig. That's going to be your first variable. Second variable is going to be how much line you let out. Okay, the more line you let out, the farther that's going to sink in the water column. So your jig weight is going to be your first variable. Heavier the jig, the more it's going to sink. Second variable, the more line you let out, obviously the more it's going to sink. Third variable is the speed of your boat, and so the faster you go, of course, the higher that's going to ride up in the water column. The slower you go, the more it's going to sink in the water column. Now, a lot of things have been put out there. There's charts, there's tables, there's information that you can pay for online. The Precision Trolling app, is out there. Lots of things that you can find. But I've discovered that there's nothing that substitutes just good old trial and error. So what I like to do is just start with whatever kind of jig I think I'm going to want to pull. So this is like a 1/16 ounce, just a lead head jig. And so I've got my 6-pound line. I'm going to be pulling it behind my boat at roughly 1 mile per hour. So what I want to do is I want to make a cast out the back of my boat, and I want to make I want to try to use the same length of cast every time with all of my rods. And the reason I do that is because it just helps me to keep that one variable sort of constant, right? I can adjust the weights of my jig, I can adjust the speed of my boat, but I like to have that same distance out the back of my boat every time, just for consistency purposes. All right, so I'm gonna throw this out, and let's just say I want to know how deep this jig is going to be out the back of my boat with a normal length cast when I'm going 1 mile per hour. So what I like to do is go over to my local lake. We're close to High Rock Lake, and go find us an area where there's a shallow, muddy bottom that's relatively snag free. What I like to do, cast this out the back of my boat, and then I like to just see how slow I need to go before this jig starts bumping bottom. Okay, I look on my graph and I see how deep the bottom is, and if I just bump my speed down until I'm going, say, like 0.7, I notice this jig starts bouncing the bottom. Okay, I want to record that. I want to maybe go up where that's a little bit shallower and just see, like, okay, when does my jig bump bottom? Okay, when I hit 1 mile per hour. Okay, and so just keep track of that, and you'll have a pretty good idea of where your jigs are running through the water. All right, another thing that you can do is change your jig weight. Now, the 16th ounce jigs, you're going to be hard pressed to get more than about 8 feet of depth out of these with a normal length cast. A couple of things you can do. Obviously, you can change your jig head. You can get a more heavy jig head. Another thing you can do is come up and add a split shot to your line. Okay, if you find that your fish are coming on your deeper rods, or rods that have heavier jig heads on them, or you're just seeing fish on your graph that are down deep, okay, add a split shot to your line, or just clip this off, put on a heavier jig head. Okay, let the fish tell you what they want, okay, and what depth to present this at. Let's talk about targeting fish at a particular depth. So if you're going along and you're seeing your fish on your graph, and you're seeing your fish and let's just say they're at 12 feet deep. You're seeing a concentration of fish 12 feet deep. How deep should you run your jigs to catch those fish? Well, you probably don't want to run them at 12 feet. Okay, so crappie feed up. So you want to run your jig so that it's slightly above that. So if you're seeing the fish at 12 feet, you want to run your jigs at 10 or 11. Okay, because they're going to come up after that bait. So you don't want to run, like if your fish are here, you don't want to run through the fish, you don't want to run under the fish, you want to run above the fish, and they'll come up to it. So that's something significant to do. Well, we appreciate you hanging out with us here at Brilliant Fishing. We've said before, the reason we call this channel Brilliant Fishing, not because we're super smart about fishing, but we're always trying to learn more. So part of this adventure is learning more about fishing. Part of it is sharing with others things that we learn along the way. Part of it is also documenting our fishing experiences. It helps us to go back and to watch those and to enjoy that time on the water all over again. So another reason that we really started this channel really goes back to my career, to my day job. Is so I'm a pastor at a local church here in Rowan County, North Carolina. It's called Grace Bible Church, and discovered that fishing is a great way to spend time with people. So I go fishing. I usually go fishing with my son. I'm going fishing with guys from church. Going fishing with my dad, or we saw a video recently with me with my uncle. So we go with my wife's dad. There's just a lot of people we go fishing with, and it's a great way to spend time with people. And so anyway, this channel is a way to kind of document all of that.